Thanks, Fabio. It's a great pleasure to open today's OeNB Talks on international and climate economics. Thanks for coming. Good afternoon to everybody. I probably start a bit to talk about how comes that we changed the name of this series. It is a series that went on now for more than almost 3 years, more than 2 years, on climate economics, and after discussing many topics on climate economics, technical topics, but also economic topics that are also summarized, these talks, in our occasional paper series in blogs or on YouTube, we thought it would be interesting, given the developments we are seeing in terms of trade, in terms of international economics, to open up this series. This is not, of course, this broader focus is not, of course, because of a perspective that thinks that climate issues and climate topics are less pressing, and will still, of course, will have series and occasions where we continue to talk about climate topics, but we thought it would be good to bring in a broader focus and also talk about what we see in the developments in international economics and in trade, in tariffs. And the title today, of course, is testament to this broader focus, tariffs, tensions and deals, global trade lost in transition. You probably recognize the similarity to the movie Lost in Translation. So I think if we talk about economics and tariff policies and how people react to it and what politicians now do sometimes, economists are a bit lost in translation and lost a bit the ability to explain to what extent tariffs have effects on economic activity. We are in a new regime, I think. That's something that is also, I think, the reason for the topic today. The new regime started already, I would say, a couple of years ago when it became even more complicated to deepen global integration, when we have been seeing more difficulties within the WTO, the World Trade Organization, to actually agree on a way forward and even to agree on already established measures. So there is a couple of member countries that would like to roll back some of these established measures, but it became more, of course, imminent and apparent in the new trade policy that the United States of America are actually pursuing. I think I don't have to talk in that format about the changes. April, with the announcement of high so-called reciprocal tariffs based on a very crude view on the balance sheet, the international balance sheet, the tariffs that are differing between the different countries, tariffs that are much higher than the tariffs we've been seeing in the years before, even higher than we've been seeing in the last decades. Tariffs being used as an instrument in industrial policy very strongly. Tariffs being used also, of course, as a leverage for some political goals much more strongly than before. And I think the distinguishing aspect is that in the years before, tariffs have been also used, of course, in international conflict sometimes. There was always a back and forth in steel and aluminum tariffs between the US and the European Union and other parts of the world. But it was confined to certain products with overcapacities around the world, and it was not an approach that was covering a broad set of tariffs. At the same time, of course, we see a development in terms of international trade agreements. Trade agreements are booming. The European Union has been very active over the last 10, 15 years to finish trade agreements, to implement them, some of them very successfully, from Canada to Japan and many other countries. But this is, of course, development that is also showing these tensions. On the one hand, multilateralism that is at difficult times. On the other hand, of course, this regional integration, the integration between different sets of countries that become deeper and deeper and that are very successful. Let me introduce our speakers today, and I'm very happy that we have you here. Let me start with our guest from the ECB, Baptiste Meunier, is trade economist in the External Developments Division of the ECB. He is there coordinating a team that produces quarterly projections for the external environment of the euro area. Thank you for coming. Pleasure to have you here. Very well qualified to talk about the topic. Gabriel Felbermayr, I think I don't have to introduce in Austria. I will do, of course, as well. He's the director of the Wirtschaftsforschungsinstitut and former president of the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. One of the people in the European Union that have published a lot about trade policies, also connections to labor market policies, international economics, very vocal, also popular books. So you might have read some of his recent books. One of the recent books is on trade. So the title was a very nice one, Freihandel hat fertig, if I'm not wrong, paraphrasing an important quote by a former coach or manager of Bayern München. This was, help me, Giovanni Trapattoni, when he was actually complaining about the ambition level of the team in one of the games before. And that's probably also something when we talk about trade liberalization and globalization that we can actually complain about. And then, of course, it's Fabio Rumler who is going to organize the discussion that we have. I think the rules of the game are explained by Fabio Rumler. He is the department head, department head of the group in the OeNB that works on trade and international economics. Thank you for organizing discussion. I'm looking forward to a very interesting and inspiring afternoon. Thanks for coming, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon with our experts here.
All right, thank you. So very briefly, the rules, the house rules for this series. I would kindly ask the presenters to limit their presentation to about 15 minutes. Then we will have the chance to react to each other, and then we'll bring in the audience. There is many visitors also online. They might pose their questions in the chat. I'm going to read it, and I'm also trying to bring in the many questions in a number of rounds that we are doing. Without further ado, I'd like to ask Gabriel Felbermayr to start with his presentation. Thank you.
Very good, Fabio. Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. It's, of course, a pleasure to be here. Sorry, Marion, that we don't meet in person. That would have been great too, but we'll try to manage with the help of technology. And the title of my intervention is about the disorder in the current system, and I will provide some eclectic observations. This is, of course, in 50 minutes, there's not much more that one can do than show a little bit of highlights on certain things. First message I want to show you is that tariffs bite before they hit. Expectations matter, big time. So this red mountain that you see on the left side, these are imports into the United States of America, price adjusted. So this is real data. And you see how it goes up from November 24 to April or so, March 25, where that index goes from 110 to 140 almost. No? So what is that? There were no tariffs in place at that time, but people were expecting tariffs and they react. Now, this chart makes this point beautifully, but I could tell you about more evidence on how tariff threats in the automotive industries in the Trump 1.0 administration led German car manufacturers relocate production in the United States, and in that period of time, car tariffs didn't arise. No, but the fear of it already does something. That is important. Tariffs are used as threats, and they work through expectations, amongst many other conjugates, of course. So that's the first message. That picture, Martin Kocher, the governor, has already alluded to. This is the 2nd of April in the Rose Garden. Today they started to break down parts of the White House, and also the garden is no longer a garden, but a concrete surface, as some say. But anyhow, at that time, springtime in Washington, tariffs ranging from 10% to some countries to 90% on Vietnam. The equation behind that has been the object of much fun, because there is some mathematics behind it, but it's based on assumptions that people find ridiculous, to using a friendly word. For example, that there are no exchange rate movements at all, that there is no retaliation at all, there are no initial tariffs at all. Okay, and of course the logic is trade balance, but on the bilateral level, the idea is to put tariffs at that number that theoretically, using this ridiculous model, that theoretically suffices to bring imports down to the level of exports, country by country. Well, that is done on the basis of, I should go back, the basis of the International Economic Emergencies Powers Act from 1977. And if you have seen yesterday the demonstrations in the United States, 7 million people, it seems, protesting against King Donald, this is what a king does, and this is what the Constitution of 1776 wanted to rule out, namely that taxes are not set by a sovereign, by an absolute ruler, but by Parliament, the Congress. And so what is happening here is deep, in the sense of what it means, the transformation of the political system of the richest and largest country in the world. So these are structural shifts, not shocks, shifts. And I think this picture will remain with us. It's a historical piece of photograph. Now, what has happened over the last 10 months or so is that in the beginning of the year, the effective average tariff rate of the United States was 2.4% on January 2nd. Then on April 2nd, it moved up. Some countries like the EU got a transition phase to negotiate, but China not. With China, it escalated. The tariff rate with China went into 145%, the retaliatory rate to 125%. So the effective average rate in April 14 reached something like 28%. Then some truce occurred between China and the United States. There's a 90-day transition phase to negotiate. The tariff rate fell down again. And then as those so-called deals happened, the average effective tariff rate moved up, and now we stand at almost 18%. Okay, that's the effective tariff rate that the US applies. Senator Welch called this utter chaos, arbitrary and willful. And if you look at the picture, it looks a little bit like that, chaos, arbitrary, willful. And there's no surprise that measures of economic uncertainty reflect this. This is the trade policy uncertainty index that colleagues in the United States put together. And you see the first period of Trump, the first administration, 2017 to 20, how the index went up. But the levels that it has reached in April 25 are unheard of. Normally the index is at 60, 70, and it reached a value of 1,200. Now we can use this data in regressions and study how this uncertainty affects trade flows, and it affects them negatively. And one can use these things then in our quantitative models to see what this does to GDP, to welfare, to prices, and so on. But I would like to draw your attention to some very recent work that I've done with Yoto Yotov in Philly, where we tried to understand what a very traditional standard gravity model of international trade can explain in the absence of bilateral asymmetries. So why is this interesting? Because the picture you saw with the table of the tariffs is based on the idea that the US trade partners are doing something asymmetric. They have much higher tariffs, and most of them actually have higher tariffs, much not, but some higher tariffs, that they have rules in place that disadvantage the Americans, and so on and so forth. Yes?
I apologize sincerely. Could you kindly read the title of the charts? Because from here it's not seen. What is it?
You cannot see it, I'm sorry. The title says, what accounts for bilateral trade imbalances? Okay? And so the message here is that if you go through all the data we have with the econometrics that's required to do this, what you can say is we can explain the bilateral trade imbalances of all countries in the world and also those of the United States without having to assume asymmetries of any sort. No? And the explanatory power of this exercise is 88%. This is pretty good. No? And of course, there is some room for asymmetries, but it is small. So the message is we do not need, alleged unfair, hidden trade costs, to explain the bilateral structure of trade. What accounts for the big surplus of China, let's say, or the European Union, and the deficit of the United States is not in the bilateral relationship, but it sits in the country-level variables. For example, excessive government deficits, loose monetary policy, these sort of things. So, and we can show that. I think the pictures are quite impressive. It's not, those 88% are not in all the sectors. If you're going to steel, as Martin said, an old, sector where controversy has always been present, you see much more variation. So though the model works less well, there is more subsidies and maybe also more home bias that works here. Then I'd like to draw your attention to a very old literature going back into the 50s. Is there any rationale to impose tariffs at all? And Henry Johnson in the 1950s, wrote the influential paper that we still cite today, that under certain assumptions, there is something like an optimal tariff. And that assumption at that time was that the country is so big that by its tariff setting, it can influence world prices. The newer literature says you don't even have to have a big country. Being a small country that has a monopoly in a niche, like Switzerland having a niche in pharmaceutical, Austria having a niches in certain sectors of machinery, also can exert that monopoly power and market. And the assumption, of course, always is that the trade partner remains passive. Once the trade partner retaliates and sets his or her own optimal tariff, then this gain goes away and the picture looks different. The idea is you can manipulate terms of trade by doing that, by reducing the world demand for the foreign goods, and by doing so, the price of the foreign good goes down and you can source at cheaper prices. That's the logic, and it allows governments like the Trump administration to capture rents from this. Another way to see is that the United States taxes foreign producers by doing so. It looks as if they tax the American consumers, but standard theories of tax incidence tell us that who carries the burden often is not the one who pays it, but it's in the entire market system where the tariff is born. And some of it is borne by the producers abroad. Now, that's the idea. If we use that in a standard model, and this is the model that we run with the Kiel Institute, we can ask what is the optimal tariff that the US should set on the EU. And what we find is 3.2% for agricultural goods and 7% for manufacturing goods. Nothing like 90 or 50 or 25. And also the EU would have an optimal tariff actually higher than the American one. That depends on elasticities and on the structure of trade, and so the model is complicated. But what we learn from this is that the observed US tariffs are much too high. Now, standard theory tells us if you miscalibrate the optimal tariff and you choose tariffs too big, then this can be welfare reducing. When you think about it as an inverse U shape, the optimal tariff is at the top of the inverse U, and then you move down as the tariff goes up, and at some point you hit the X line, and then the value becomes negative. And it seems that this is the case in the United States. Now, that's something that I'd like to skip because we can maybe do that in the discussion. The Turnberry deal, the essence of it, what it includes, this funny equation, 15% on everything. Or if the MFN rate is higher than this, some exceptions, promises that are funny, as if the leader of the European Commission could promise to buy 750 billion of energy, as if she had the mandate. It is, of course, not the case. We can discuss this, but what's more important is the last three elements here, that this deal violates essentially everything that matters in international trade law. It violates not just some article, but the first, Article 1 in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which forbids discrimination. Yeah, most favored nation clause, that's the technical word, it says you do not discriminate. You cannot have a tariff of 10% on UK, or 15 on Europe, and on 39 on Switzerland, except if you have free trade agreements with these countries. That's in Article 24, but there are preconditions for these agreements. Essentially, Article 24 says you have to liberalize trade. You cannot do discrimination if you de-liberalize trade. So basic conditions are violated. And then what is maybe worst, if the EU accepts this, and the EU does, Japan does the same, UK did the same, and maybe because we didn't have any better opportunities. But if we accept that, we essentially legitimate the breach of WTO law, no? Which is a problem. And of course, all this does not really eliminate uncertainty, the problem that I talked about at the beginning. Now we can throw this into our models, and again, I will not bore you on this, just show what we can do. We can now run trade models for the whole world. Of course, every country is in there, but we can zoom in on the NUTS2 regions, or NUTS2 regions in the European Union. So look at Carinthia and Vienna and Lower Bavaria separately. And what's interesting is that all Europe is red, no? So we see export losses everywhere, and some places are hit heavier than others. No? For example, Bratislavski Kraj, close to here, has a lot of car assembly, a lot of German car manufacturing there. Or Cologne. Cologne has Ford and a lot of high-tech industry. Veneto, machinery. Okay, so it's interesting. This variation is big, and I think more or less plausible to explain. On GDP, a loss of 0.2%, approximately. Okay, other models come with similar numbers, and again, heterogeneity. So it looks that Carinthia here is hit harder than other places in Austria because semiconductors exposed that province very strongly to the US market. And the Southern Ireland, or not Southern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, very heavily affected. What these simulations do is they look only at the Turnberry deal, and they do not take into account that, for example, Switzerland or the UK or Norway have got their own deals. So this is only Turnberry. Now, if we bring everything into the picture and look at the state of play as of October 5th this year, and that includes the deal with with Europe and with Japan and with England and so on, then this is what occurs to the US economy compared to a baseline without all these changes. The baseline of January, let's say, 2025. And what's interesting to see is first the overall real GDP goes down. That's on the right side. So this idea that we also see in our model of over-calibrating the optimal tariff is right. So it's too much. You also see that this does reindustrialize the United States of America. So total manufacturing gains, 2.7% of real value added. But you see, this is the blue shadowed area. This is paid by something. If one sector is to grow, other sectors have to shrink under the conditions of almost full employment. And the sector that has to shrink is advanced manufacturing. So if you think reindustrialization, you get iron and steel and aluminium, and you pay for it by a smaller advanced manufacturing sector. Also, construction has to give. Why? Because construction workers are good substitutes for manufacturing workers. Now that's within the US. This here is then across countries. And again, there are interesting things here. The US loses, China loses, but Canada, Mexico actually gain, and the EU too. Now this is the Yale Budget Lab calculations. Why is it that the EU gains? Because the deal that we have is bad for us, as you've seen before, but other countries have gotten worse deals. And because when we talk about competitiveness, it is relative prices that matter. Our 10 or 15% tariffs leave us better off than the 39% that the Swiss have. And so this mutes the losses, and makes even a small benefit out of it. Canada and Mexico, similar stories. Do you have to retaliate in such a situation? This is a picture of Ralf Osser in his trade war paper of 2016, best response functions. And what you see is they're almost horizontal or almost vertical. That means you cannot incite your trade partner by setting your own optimal tariff to reduce his or her optimal tariff, right? But it is still optimal in these models to retaliate. No? And in our model, we would see essentially those tariffs I mentioned before. This would be the optimal reaction under the assumption that there is no thing as the shadow of war. No? So, and I think we cannot discuss trade policy with the United States without talking about Ukraine. No? And of course, this completely ignores all these things. So this is just, textbook economics. Last slide. Science is beautiful again, in all sorts of dimensions. What this shows is, what happens when we have no final goods trade or no intermediate goods trade, or if we shock countries into autarky. Luxembourg, 80% of loss. This would mean, if you take this literally, people will starve there. This would be dramatic. Austria would lose something like 28% of its GDP. But the United States, only 5 or 6. China, 7. India, a little bit more. So who is in this world going to wreak havoc with the international trade order? It's not the small countries. No, but the lesson for the small countries is obvious. No, coalitions, alliances. No, and that's, I think, a message that transpires from here. It's true for countries. It's also true for companies. In this environment, being big is helpful. If you produce both in the United States and in Europe, you're better off than if you produce only in Europe and serve the foreign market by exports, for obvious reasons. Okay, I think I've talked too long. I'm sorry for that, but I'll stop here. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Gabriel, for this presentation and for sticking broadly to the time frame. Next is, broadly, yeah. Next is Baptiste from the ECB.
Yeah, so while we wait for the slides, thanks a lot for having me there in the non-bald section of the table. That's a pleasure to be. And I will try to focus my intervention on whether we are seeing the start of a fragmenting world. So the usual disclaimer applies, so it does not represent the opinion of the ECB, so now I can say whatever I want. And whatever I want to say is actually this. So prior to 2025, we were actually already witnessing what we call a selective decoupling across geopolitical line, notably for strategic products like high-tech. Now, the recent US tariffs are somehow contributing to this trade fragmentation by widening the geopolitical divide between US and China. But at the same time, those recent tariffs are a bit blurring the pre-existing geopolitical line for two reasons. Because US tariffs also apply to US allied countries and also to neutral countries like India. And also because of trade aversion effects from China, which can actually bring China trade to an increase with the rest of the world except the US. Now, what I want to bring also as another nuance to fragmentation is that tariffs do not fully eliminate dependencies, but they create some indirect linkages via connector country, meaning that the US would still be reliant on China, but just those goods would transit through third countries like Mexico, Vietnam, or Malaysia. Now, a last point is that, we put a lot of emphasis on tariff, and I think this is well due, but it's important to know that beyond tariff, export restrictions are also increasingly used for geopolitical reasons. And that matters because even if export restrictions target smaller amounts than tariff, they actually target those critical inputs that are hard to replace, and these can cause a lot of economic damage. So let me just start with reviewing the state of fragmentation before Trump came into power, and what we observe, as I just said, is selective decoupling along geopolitical lines. And so this is illustrated there with a chart on the left, where we can see that actually the Western bloc import share from the East bloc, so let's say a China-led bloc, actually already started to decline over 2017, 2019, and this is visible on the left panel. And this trend accelerated a lot after the COVID, so this is 2021, 2030, which we see in the middle panel. And this was notably driven by the coupling between Russia and the EU and between China and the US. So if we turn a bit to product dimension and we go to the right chart, and there we report import share from China for the US in yellow and then for the EU in blue. And then we see that there have been different patterns across product. So we can see that for high-tech product, and those are the plain line, then you can see a clear decline in the import share from China, but this is not the case for product essential to the green transition. Those are the dashed lines. So there's also a product dimension, which means that these decoupling actually happen for some product, but not for the other. Now, another important point to note is that these selective decoupling reduce some direct dependencies between the US and China, but actually created also some indirect trade linkages. And this is visible there on the left, where what we report is the Chinese value added in US import from Mexico, Vietnam, and Taiwan. And there we see that this has increased over the year, meaning that actually Chinese value added still reaches the US, but it does so via so-called connector countries, which there we have 3 examples. And actually the effect appears to be more pronounced for those sectors that are more heavily tariffed by the US. And this is shown on the right, where each blue dot is a sector, and then on the x-axis you have the share of trade, which is tariffed by the US, and on the y-axis you have the change in indirect value added of China still reaching the US. And there you can see that there is a positive correlation between the two, which tend to show that actually the more the US put tariff on a product, the more it found an indirect route to still reach the US via third countries. Now, I talked a lot about the West, but actually this configuration of trade was not solely a Western-led pattern. And there we see that China trade also changed dramatically after 2021. And this is shown particularly with the chart on the left, where you can see that the actual imports in China, so this is a plain yellow line, decouple somehow from this pre-pandemic trend, which is the dashed yellow line. And this was partly because of some structural policies implemented by China, most notably Made in China 2025, which aimed actually at reducing Chinese reliance on foreign inputs. And this reconfiguration actually happened mostly at the expenses of the West, because if you compare Chinese imports now versus what they were in 2021, and this is done on the right, we can see that there's a marked decline of Chinese imports from advanced economies from the Western bloc, notably the US and the EU, while Chinese imports from emerging countries like the ASEAN or other emerging countries beyond Southeast Asia actually remain broadly stable. So now, I mean, as the economy is little by little fragmenting, the key question is how the world could be expected to fragment. And this is a geopolitical map that we had essentially before Trump. And we envisage a geopolitical world divided in 3 blocks. So there was the Western bloc led by the US in blue, the Eastern bloc led by China in red, and then neutral countries in gray in the middle. And the natural question since then is whether our vision of this geopolitical map survived to Trump tariff. And actually it did not do so great, because there you can see that US tariffs since December were broad-based rather than happening only for geopolitical foes. And this is visible there. As you can see, some US-allied countries in blue, like Switzerland or Canada, actually got high tariff, while some countries that before we thought would belong to the East Bloc actually got relatively less in red. And what's maybe more important is to see that actually some neutral countries like India, Brazil, or Mexico got relatively high tariff, which over time is something that might actually draw them closer to China and reshape to some extent the geopolitical maps that I just showed you. Now, still, one consistency in the US trade policy was that China actually got a relatively high tariff, and this can be expected to deepen the divide between China and the US. And this is actually confirmed if you do model simulation of those tariffs using something which I think is relatively close to the model that Gabriel just presented. And this is shown on the left. And there, you can see that if you do this, you can see that there is a large drop in US import from China. This is the yellow bar on the left. And symmetrically, a large drop in Chinese exports to the US, and this is a dark blue bar. And this is what you have in model simulation on the left, but this is also pretty much confirmed by actual trade data for goods only, which you have on the right, where you can see for US import on the left panel, so there was this front loading in Q1 that Gabriel already talked about, but then in Q2 and Q3, you can see that actually US import from China declined a lot, and symmetrically, Chinese exports to the US, the dark blue column, actually declined. Now, taking this picture, there are two things that stand a bit out if we look at them from a geopolitical perspective. And the first one is that not all trade flows there move according to geopolitical line. And this is notably the case for US import from Europe, which actually declined, so this is in red there, both in the model and in actual trade data, while at the same time, Chinese exports to Europe actually increased. And the second point that is a bit puzzling from a geopolitical perspective is that we can see that there is relatively high US import from Southeast Asia, in the left panel on the left in the light blue column, and symmetrically, there are relatively high Chinese exports to Southeast Asia. So this might suggest, and this raises the question of whether those countries are a bit acting as connector for Chinese goods via those countries into the US. So we'll tackle those two questions, and let me first start with the first one, which was, to some extent, export losses to the US are offset by trade redirection to third countries. And this is shown on the left chart. So this is a model simulation using different calibration of trade elasticity in blue and yellow, just to give some upper bound and lower bound to this trade aversion effect. And what we see that the model would point to actually broad-based trade redirection of Chinese exports toward all those countries, with the strongest happening toward Mexico and Canada. Now, if we focus just on the euro area, and this is on the right chart, there we can see that under the current tariff, so this is a vertical red line there, trade redirection can be estimated to be relatively limited, with Chinese exports to the euro area increasing by between 1% to 4%. But it could be relatively higher, around 9%, under the 100% increase in tariffs that was just threatened by President Trump. Now, just keep in mind, those are model simulations. So under model simulation, we find relatively limited trade redirection. But the actual trade diversion can be much higher than predicted by the model because of some factors that were not captured by the model. And there, one of them in the left is a persistent decline in Chinese export prices since 2023 in the red line on the left, which has supported Chinese competitiveness and actually continues to do so as Chinese exporters are compressing their margin to decline these export prices as of recently. Another reason for strong Chinese exports is also something in international economics which is called vent for surplus mechanism. And this is a mechanism under which, for a sector, if you have weak domestic sales and fixed investment, then firms in that sector are basically left with excess capacity. And since there's weak domestic sales, then they redirect their sales toward a foreign market and they export more. And this mechanism actually clearly appears at play in China, where you can see that there is much stronger export for sectors with weak domestic sales, and this is the left panel on the right, if you compare that to sectors with relatively more robust domestic sales on the right panel. And the takeaway is that those two factors actually could act as catalysts to trade redirection and mean that actual trade redirection could exceed what I just showed you from model simulation. Now, let me go to the second question, which was whether the redirection of Chinese exports reflects some trade rerouting where China exports to third countries and then those third countries just re-exports to the US. And model simulation of geopolitical decoupling, which are there shown on the left, would suggest that this is indeed the case. And there we can see that re-export to the United States from China would actually increase by 15% if there is a geopolitical decoupling. And these model simulations actually are relatively consistent with what happened in reality. And then we turn to the right chart, where what we report are on the x-axis, what we call excess export of China to Southeast Asian country. And on the y-axis, this is US excess import from Southeast Asia. And if we focus just on the product in red, so this is electrical machinery, vehicle, scientific instrument, or rubber, we can see that there are almost a one-to-one correlation between the two, which is hinting toward a possible rerouting of those Chinese goods via the Southeast Asian country and then into the US. Now, as I said initially, having talked about tariff, I mean, tariff are an important reshaping force of global trade, but something that is also as important as the fact that export restriction, notably on critical raw materials, have been on the rise since 2008. So I won't talk much about the chart on the left because I think Marion will do, and this is OECD data which just shows that export restrictions are actually on the rise since the past 20 years. And those export restrictions on those critical raw materials are particularly harmful because for a number of those critical raw materials, there's a high degree of export concentration. And this is shown on the right, where you can see that export concentration in those three minerals that we selected there, so it's cobalt, magnesium, and lithium, has been on the increase since the 90s. And another observation is that among these export restrictions, meaning that actually the supply is concentrated over just a few suppliers, those are dominated pretty much by emerging countries, and notably China in red there. Even in lithium, which is the rightmost panel, where you can see that this was dominated by Western countries in the 90s and the 2000s, but is now dominated by China in red. And just to broaden a bit the scope, I mean, export restriction can apply to a broader scope of products than just critical raw material and can affect any critical dependencies, so like semiconductors, magnet, or anything beyond just rare earths and minerals. And so what we did in this slide is we assessed the extent of critical dependencies for the US and for the Euro area. And the left chart shows you the number of products that qualify as critical dependency. And what we can see is that over the year, for both Euro area and the US, actually the number of critical dependencies vis-à-vis China increased by a lot, and this is the red line there, to the point that this is now the first source of critical dependencies, much more than other countries and much more than the US and the Euro area have on each other, which is indicated by the blue line. And now the implication of this is that this has increased the cost of geopolitically driven supply shock to those critical dependencies, which we quantified on the right using a model. And there you can see that for both the United States and the Euro area, the cost of a supply disruption to those critical dependencies is much higher in 2023, which is shown in red, than it was in 1995, which is shown in yellow. And this chart also on the right shows you why export restrictions are so important, because you can see that even though those export restrictions would apply only on a very limited share of intermediate input, which is shown by those red dots, actually the effect on final demand are 15 times more important than the share of input disrupted. And this happens because those goods are notoriously hard to replace, meaning that even if they target only a very small quantity, they can have demultiplicated effect then on final demand via the propagation through supply chain. And with that, I just put back my key message, and I thank you for your attention.
Since we are already a bit behind schedule, if there are any comments that the presenters want to make on the other presenters' presentations, keep that in mind and maybe include it in the statement, in the next statement, the response to the first round of questions. So I'm opening the floor here for questions in the audience and also online. Online, as I said before, just type it in and I'll read it. But who wants to break the ice here in the lecture hall? I see Professor Landesmann. Let's have 3 questions at the beginning. And Franz Naschnick, please.
It was a very differentiated and complex picture, which you showed from different angles. Let me try to point to a factor which makes it even more complex. In the European debate, we talk a lot about the costs of strategic autonomy. Yeah? If we apply that to US, obviously it sounds from an economic point of view in terms of all the welfare costs that a lot of welfare costs are involved in American strategy and a lot of erratic and chaotic behavior. But the element which I wanted to bring in is the importance of military capacity and technological capabilities. And I wonder in which way you could capture that in modeling here. Gabriel talked about the differentiation of different sectors within the manufacturing sector, that high-tech sectors might suffer in terms of employment reallocation to other sectors. But it could very well be that in the competition between China and the US, the development of medium mid-tech production of weaponry, of ships, of planes, etc., together with service technology, might be one of the overriding motivations, yeah, in terms of the type of strategic autonomy. And of course, there are implications further on in terms of if you are highly dependent on technology inputs from other countries before and you want to build up your own technological capabilities in certain areas, obviously there are lots of fixed costs involved initially, yeah, and a lot of initial costs, which might, in order to catch up, I think that same thing will apply for Europe in terms of chip making and artificial intelligence. If you want to catch up after having lost a certain gap, there are lots of short-term, even medium-term costs involved. So I just wondered, from a modeling point of view, could you capture some of these issues, which I think, to judge the overall scenario which is evolving at the moment, seems to be a very, very important factor.
Second is Franz Nauschnick.
Two questions. First question is, we have not only tariffs, we have also exchange rates. And the euro has revalued very strongly against the dollar, but also against the Chinese currency. How do you see this influences? I think it's more to Baptiste to answer this question. Second question is, it was mentioned trade policy and industrial policy, the connection. In Austria, in the 80s, we had a connection between trade policy and industrial policy with the automotive clusters. We threatened the Germans that we would lower the tariffs for Japanese cars to zero until they buy some Austrian products. This is why voestalpine is delivering steel to the German automotive industry. The most successful was not trade policy, it was research and development. We had a diesel engine which we gave to BMW, still producing the engines in Austria. We had four-wheel drives giving to Mercedes, still producing in Austria. The least successful was subsidies for FDI. Thank you.
And third is Professor Novotny in the first row.
No, just in addition to the issue of exchange rates, another element is foreign direct investments. To what extent can we see that this kind of new trade battles have influenced foreign direct investments, especially European investments in the US? We have had, of course, a number of investments there, but this was mainly due to lower energy costs, also lower wage costs. Is there an additional intensity to be observed?
Okay, who wants to go first? I think Gabriel has been addressed.
So thank you very much for all these interesting and challenging questions. Michael Landesmann, very important issues that you bring up. And we don't, in our models that we use for analysis, we do not really have a special place for military equipment. Those models are also not truly dynamic. So we don't have an endogenous response of productivities to tariff protection, for example. There are models of that type. I've myself tried some of this in my doctoral thesis, actually. The problem is that there's nothing robust. So you take your preferred model of Schumpeterian growth or some learning by doing model, and the implications differ. So that's, I think, why the profession is a bit struggling with coming up with a framework. But it is certainly important, what we, from a game theoretic point of view, might think is that the buildup of industrial capacity in China is influencing the game over Taiwan, right? Because being able to produce steel at no limit, at no limitation, and many other materials that are maybe relevant for war is an important threat. So if the Chinese invade Taiwan and we see how powerful their industry is, that might discourage retaliatory action. No? So and that is interesting, I think, to discuss with our game theoretic models at the back of the mind. Exchange rate, yes, absolutely, and interesting things happened. No, so on April 2nd, actually when it was clear that Trump was to be re-elected, the dollar appreciated. Okay, and this is what standard theory would say, that an import tariff should actually work towards making the currency of the import tariff imposing countries stronger, no? Because you shorten the supply of dollars in the world markets by importing less, and that should push up the exchange rate. Now, after the over-calibration that happened on the April 2nd, I mean, people said this is no optimal tariff, this is just crazy. No, the exchange rate fell down, no, and it has stabilized since then. And I think this is interesting. There's very interesting work being done by Oleg Itzkoki at Harvard and co-authors on redoing optimal tariff theory in the presence of debt. International debt, and the value of the debt changes, of course, with the exchange rate movements, and that it reduces optimal tariffs quite a bit. No? This is, if you have time, this is very, I think path-breaking work that's being done by Itzkoki and Mukin at Cambridge. On the Austrian, industrial policies of the past, I leave these to experts. I'm not a good economic historian. But overall, so if you read again the literature and the textbook insights on industrial policy, there is reason to be skeptical. There are stories of success, but there are many untold stories of failure. Failure is not often talked about. So we know Airbus, and we know the Austrian automotive cluster, but we don't have much about those companies that have never made it into being companies or champions and so on. So I'm skeptical on this, to be honest. And on FDI, Ewald Novotny, it's very hard to come up with credible counterfactuals. And this is what you said, no? Other things are happening. Energy prices have diverged a lot after 2022 between America and Europe, and that invites reallocation of investment. And the simple fact that Europe had a dismal growth experience, and also the demographic evolution, all this depresses FDI into Europe, and invites investment of European investors into the United States. But if you look at industrial production data in the United States, it's essentially flat. Over the Trump 1 period, flat. Over Biden, flat. Now flat. So if there is investment, then it has stabilized capacity, and it has not expanded it. So this is, there's some growth, but not. It's almost flat, I would say. So these ideas to use tariffs tariff threats, is mostly in Trump 1, to get an increase in industrial capacity in the United States, I think this did not work. At least not until today. Maybe, who knows, no? And today what we hear a lot from companies is that they refrain from investing in the United States because they do not know. If you build a car plant in, let's say in Alabama, and then next day the tariff dispute with Mexico is settled, and the competitors go into Mexico, produce there at half the costs, and then import into the United States tariff-free, then you have your expensive asset in the United States, and it's not profitable. And so it rather looks as if investment is withheld. And the last comment, often people believe that labor is cheap in the United States, that workers can be had for very low wages, and this is absolutely not true. Manufacturing workers with qualifications are expensive in America, and they're scarce, and they do there's a lot of job churning. No? And so again, this I think reduces the appetite to invest in the US, and explains why not much I think has happened so far.
Okay, I guess now Governor Kocher has a comment as well. You want to make it now?
If I may, very quickly, actually, on the last point as well, and then unfortunately, I'm very sorry, I have to go for a meeting, so I just want to take then the opportunity to thank everybody. But let me just add to the last point. I think the inconsistencies in the U.S. economic policy, will unravel at some time. They have tariffs, and they like the revenue of these tariffs. And this is often mentioned, of course, because it helps, of course, to balance the budget, given the tax cuts that have been made in permanence. But on at the same stage, they want to actually they want to incentivize relocation of companies. But if that's successful, of course, the revenues will be gone. So you can't have both here. And the same is true, of course. They, on the one hand, will want to reduce the deficit in their current account, which I understand given the deficits that have been there, but that would mean also that they will have less foreign direct investment, because the capital account, of course, has to actually be balanced then as well, actually. So, and both will not be possible in the long run. This is inconsistent. So at some stage, this will unravel, and I'm pretty sure it will be difficult to sustain the narrative that is around in the US thus far. How long that takes and what kind of focus it will have, we'll see. But this might be contributing to some chaotic also economic policy stances during the next couple of years, unfortunately. But let me just, and I'm not closing the session, sorry, but let me take the opportunity to thank Marion, thanks a lot, Baptiste, Gabriel, and of course Fabio and all the organizers, the event team. I'll have to leave silently in a few minutes, but thanks a lot for doing that, and I'm handing over to Fabio again.
Yeah, thank you for being the host today. I'm handing over to Baptiste if you have something to add.
Yeah, thanks. I can add something, notably on competitiveness, because I was targeted there. So yes, we indeed measure competitiveness, and I can echo the point that Gabriel made, is that the European Union is gaining competitiveness in the US market by being essentially less tariffs than the others. But you need to take if you take a broader measure of competitiveness, so if you include relative prices and if you include FX, in fact, what happened is that this relative gain in competitiveness from US tariff is more than offset by the euro appreciation. And actually what we've seen is since the beginning of 2025, if anything, Europe has lost competitiveness. And for China, they have much more tariffs than us, but actually since the renminbi has been depreciating and since they have been lowering their prices relative to basically every other exporter in the world, they actually would gain competitiveness. And even for the US, because there's some retaliation, which indeed hurts the competitiveness of US exporters, but there's so much depreciation in the dollar that actually they would gain some competitiveness. So this is, you need to take a bit this broader picture of competitiveness, and there it doesn't look so rosy for Europe actually. So these tariffs might play out more for long-term gains, you know, when FX movement smoothen a bit. And there we might see over the long term, and you know, according to and in line with the models that actually Gabriel presented, there that could end up with some gains from Europe in terms of export, notably to the US. Now on the point of FDI, so we've done some research already at the ECB, and there is, in parallel to this decoupling in trade flows that I already discussed in my presentation, there's also a decoupling in FDI, and you can see that there is more west-to-west flow and more east-to-east flow, and much less west-to-east and east-to-west. Now this Trump policy, I mean, have in a sense the potential to deepen that divide, but as Gabriel said also, there's a lot of investment that has been committed to the US, but nothing is really sure there. I mean, not least because the Commission, I mean, committed to some investment in the US, while this is mostly firm investing in the US, and the European Commission does not have power to commit on these type of things. And this is already, I mean, we have seen that in Trump 1. There were some big announcements over investment in the US, which in some cases absolutely never materialized. So we need to treat that a bit with caution, whether we'll see more FDI going into the US from Western partners in the years to come. And finally, just on this technological war, I mean, this is a bit the point between the US and China. I know they're a bit taken in this war over the supremacy for technology. And this, I mean, in some point could be helped if you tariff only technological good, or if you target some part of the supply chain of technological good. And this is something that has been done before Trump. Now, if you remember Biden IRA, they were targeting specific elements needed for tariff. So they were trying to address a bit this thing of strategic autonomy for the US, saying they need to be autonomous in terms of electric vehicle and all the supply chain. And actually there, if you model that, what you see is that actually it kind of succeeds in the US, because then you see production of EVs, of batteries increasing. I mean, this happened always at the expense of other sectors. So the net impact on US output is not so clear, but at least for strategic autonomy reason, you might have some reason to increase production in those particular sectors. But actually what we are seeing now from Trump is the exact opposite, because actually some goods where he might want to get a bit more US dominance, like rare earths, are actually excluded from tariff. And what are tariff are industries that are not so technological. No? Tariffing steel and alu and copper is not really something that we could see as an industry of the future. So it's a bit there, the disconnect between, indeed, this technological war happening between US and China and what we're actually seeing in the US tariff, which does not really abide by this logic of technological war, or at least not to a bigger extent.
Thank you, Baptiste. Now let's open the second round of questions. Who else? I have one online, which I'm going to ask as well. I saw Julia Wirtz there, and then maybe you. Yeah. So microphone for Julia. So since there are a number of questions here, please keep the questions relatively short and also the answers.
It's more an observation than a question, but I think Gabriel has shown very nicely on one of his slides that we have certainly moved away from the rules-based system to the power play deals-based system. However, in Europe, we seem to sort of hold up the rules-based flag. And so then I was shocked by Marion's graph, which showed that, and I think this was this matrix you shown, where you showed that EU has not increased any trade ties. I think it was based on trade, on exports or imports or something, that we have not managed, in particular with North Africa or with no major bloc, we have sort of increased trade. And I wonder, why is that? And at the same time, if I'm not mistaken, the EU did conclude quite a few preferential trade agreements with some important blocs. So why is that not seen in the figures, or do we undersell ourselves? Or what's wrong there?
Following up on something that I think it's already started to be discussed, I think if you think about a situation where tariffs are on average between 10 and 20%, I mean, the efficiency losses from this, that's kind of bad, but it's not life-threatening, at least not if you look at it from a static point of view, like as we talk about Habecker triangles. I mean, you can have a lot of Habecker triangles and still survive. What is much, I think, potentially much more threatening are the dependencies on all the intermediate inputs now from China, because it's not only rare earth. There's a large array of things where I'm not even sure we have a list of essential things which are potentially very threatening to us. And my question, one could address those issues in a number of ways. Either, let's say, that Western country plus some friends are trying together to do some industrial and trade policy to reduce these dependencies, or pile up, let's say, a big stock of things in order to at least survive for a while. And my question is, I have no idea, are people really seriously on the political sphere, international organizations, are we really trying to seriously address this issue? Or maybe it is not as bad as I think, or is it hopeless anyway? I mean, how do you see this? I find this is for my perception of first order importance, but I don't know what the situation is. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Andreas, I've seen your hand, but wait, I'm going to take the next question from the online audience. I'm going to read it. In Professor Felbermayer's final slide, he suggested large economies like the US and China are better insulated from a trade war than smaller economies like Austria or Luxembourg. How much does being inside the EU mitigate risks for small states? how resilient is the EU as a 27-nation bloc vis-à-vis China and Russia? So who wants to start this time? There has been a correction, though, by Jonathan, who posed the last question. He corrected himself. It is the last question was, how resilient is the EU as a 27-nation bloc vis-à-vis China and the US, not Russia, as he put initially?
Okay. So on the disappointing trade performance, Julia, I think what we've seen, Marion, were shares, right?
No, I didn't mean performance. I meant integration with other.
Yes.
I mean, finding alliances. I think this is what we should do more.
Yes, no, I would absolutely agree. First of all, but even then, so shares don't tell us much, no? In a context where the European economy has been for decades underperforming the world average, so that we are losing shares with everyone. Even South Korea or trade agreements shift things, but do not change growth rates, right? So we might have a larger market share in Korea with the agreement than if we had no agreement. But the fact that we grow at 1%, 1 point something, peanuts, and the world grows at 3%, necessarily means that our shares go down. So, but I think one could do more. And it is, the governor said that Europe has done a lot of trade agreements. So the boom of trade agreements was in the early 2000s or so. Since then, no. And we also did anti-trade agreements. I mean, the Brexit is an absolutely anti-agreement. It does exactly the opposite. So the big ones have not been done, right? So yes, New Zealand, great. But the United States, TTIP, no. Let's see whether we get Mercosur going. I'd love it, but it's not yet ratified. India, negotiations for many years now. Indonesia, big economy, negotiations for many years now. Nothing much happening. So I'm not so sure whether we have such an enormously successful trade policy agenda. Yes, Japan is a nice thing. Canada works, but Canada is 30 million people. Canada is half the UK. Okay, so relatively, I would not say that this is such a big, that's a big success story. On Michael Harberger triangles, yes, you're right. So, the GDP effect is essentially real income, a welfare metric, and the Trump tariffs cost us 0.2% of GDP. Okay, so that is not big. You're right. What these models don't capture is uncertainty. And then certain uncertainty itself is detrimental because it leads to the postponement of investment in these sort of things. Also, those models are at a very, very high level of granularity. So we have, the steel sector, and we have machinery and cars, but we do not look within. No, so those models cannot really say much about what happens if rare earths don't arrive anymore. And so you are more worried about, trade being stopped entirely here. My worry is actually not about rare earths directly or photovoltaic cells or these sort of things. Of course, if we don't have them, it's annoying. No? We want to build windmills, and we need the rare earths for that. We want to decarbonize, and for that we need solar panels. But I'm much more concerned about consumables. Things that we need, no? And if we don't have them, people starve or freeze. No? So gas, medicine, ammunition in the case of a war. No? On no chance we have that. I feel this is ridiculous. No? If we talk about security, we should ask: are we able, if someone attacks us, to at least have the ammunition to use the guns that we might have? And so consumables and durables, I think, should be distinguished. I'm a bit annoyed that this doesn't happen. Durables can be stocked. If you don't, if the stock of durables depreciates over 3 years because supplies are disrupted, it's not nice. But if consumables are not there, we have, lives are threatened. So, and then on the EU, we have done some work on this, on simulating trade shocks with the EU being destroyed and with the EU being intact. And there it becomes very obvious that the EU protects us against exogenous shocks from abroad. by allowing intra-trade to take some role or absorb some of the damage. Lionel Fontanier has a nice paper with Yoto on asking how much internal integration in Europe we would need to compensate a decoupling with China. And the answer is almost nothing. If we reduce non-tariff trade barriers in Europe by, I don't know, 2 or 3 percentage points, we would compensate the welfare loss coming from a complete stop in trade with China. So that's a DG Grow paper. I think it's forthcoming at the GRE now or something like that. Lionel Fontanier and Yoto. Thanks.
Baptiste.
Thanks. I'll keep it short. I just wanted to tackle the point on critical dependencies because that's part of what we showed and part of research that we've done at the ECB. And so what we've seen is that indeed critical dependencies increased for Europe and for the US vis-à-vis China. And this is not only critical raw material that we discussed about, but this is also consumer goods, notably in electronics, where we are critically dependent, but this is also essential chemicals process. And what we did using a model which has a bit more granularity than traditional I/O is to simulate the effect. And there we find some relatively big effect because those are hard to substitute. And then you're basically stuck with having China as your provider, even though the price increased 10 times or 15 times. And this is where we show that actually the share of input disrupted, the difference between the share of input disrupted and then the effect on final demand is 20 times. So essentially a small effect, small disruption, but then bigger effect because that propagates through supply chain. Now, just on what is done, I think the EU is doing something. I mean, there's been the CRM Act done, but I think those are relatively recent measures. Those are measures that were done in 2023. And for rare earth mineral, I mean, this is typically something with a relatively long lead time of 5 to 8 years. And also we have to factor in that, I mean, China dominates the supply chain of this because they have some advantages which are there. On rare earth, they have developed some technological advances that allow them to process them in a way that probably we are not able to do. So it's hard to compensate for those things. But this is indeed, I would agree, this is where the EU could do more, doing some EU-wide procurement, some EU-wide project, trying to foster some EU-wide champion on those strategic products. And then I hope I was.
Thank you. So we can have another round of questions. We have 13 minutes left. So how many more questions do we have from the audience? Okay, I can see. Okay, I think Andreas was first, and then the others back there.
I am a bit, let's say, even disappointed, to be honest, that we talk a lot about all these technicalities of how to improve our strategic decision situation in the one or the other field without really talking about the roots of all these troubles we are in. And I mean, I see at least some truth in the criticism of Trump, and that is simply that trade with the United States has been unbalanced. And for not only for a couple of years, but for decades. And I think, I mean, and of course we could ask ourselves whether this is overstating this or whatever reason this might be. But the question, of course, that comes into mind, I think we should at least answer this question. Did we have been too benign on these global imbalances over the last decades? Did we take it too lightly? And should we have really taken into account that, of course, it's nice to be an export champion, but at the same time, you always have to think that the other side should also get a chance to get the respective exports into your country. And if you don't give this chance, at least over a couple of decades, over a longer period of time, of course, during export-led growth, development period, it's clear you need to have more exports. But later on, I mean, in particularly thinking of Europe, that's a bit weird argument. And Europe and Asia, we both are really similar in a sense, including China, in having indeed tried to permanently have surplus in export, which I'm wondering whether you really think that this is a healthy situation. And if this was one of the causes, then of course, could this be one step forward towards a path where we find solutions? And how could this be developed? Thanks.
So next is, I just saw the hand, I didn't see the person. Yeah, you.
Yeah, very short. I'm always impressed about the models and about the data. I've been wondering, and I want to know, are you also reflecting sanctions in the models? And the second question is, what about military deliveries? They come from overseas, probably to Ukraine, and paying is something, somehow different countries. Is this addressed in your models and in your analysis? Thank you.
And there was another one just beside. No? Okay. Then I add a very short question. As an observer of the forecasts, I wonder why we see so little in the data, right? I mean, especially concerning inflation in the US, but also I remember the forecasts a year ago that talked about 1.5 percentage points less GDP growth in the US and also in Europe, and 2 or 1.5 percentage point higher inflation in the US. So far, we see little. Institutions have revised upwards their forecasts in a row. So what is your thinking why these negative expectations did not materialize in the data so far? Baptiste, your final remark?
Yeah, so thanks. I'll try to be short as well, and I'll start with the forecast. So we are seeing relatively little to date in US inflation indeed, but you have to recall also that before there was all this front loading before in the end of 24 and the beginning of 25, which means that now US producers and retailers would have these high inventories, meaning that then the pass-through to inflation could take a bit more time. And then so far, they are absorbing a bit, this US producer and retailers are absorbing some in their margin, but they could pass on to consumer relatively progressively. So in that sense, we expect more that this is more a delayed pass-through than something of saying that there's no pass-through of those tariffs to inflation. And this front-loading is also one reason why we are seeing the economy and GDP being so resilient in the first half of 2025, because all this front-loading is a bit distorting the picture. And if you focus just on the core component, which would be private consumption and business investment, you're seeing actually another picture, which is a decline from 24, which could be expected to continue actually in the second half of this year. And just to finish on this forecast, so we revised our expectation, but you have to factor in that Trump did not only do tariff, also the fiscal stimulus in the US is something that is supportive of growth, and this is one reason also why we revised up our GDP forecast for the US. Now, just one quick point on trade imbalances. I mean, we've seen also rising global imbalances because we have been seeing US fiscal deficit and China having overcapacities. And if we wanted to correct that, I mean, it means that the US should do some fiscal consolidation and China should suppress overcapacities. And what we're seeing is actually exactly the opposite, with the US, if anything, doing more fiscal stimulus and China actually doing more and more supply-driven policy. So if anything, these tariffs are not really addressing the root cause of those global imbalances. And in that sense, that's also what Gabriel showed a bit in this presentation, that tariffs are not really addressing the root cause of those global imbalances. And let me finish there.
Thank you, Baptiste. Gabriel, you have the privilege to supply the last thought that will keep on our minds.
So, supply of thoughts, all right. Yes, I think we need to discuss much more about placing the tariff war into the global macro economy and talk about those imbalances that have built up over time. I am concerned about the debt level that this has entailed. So if you run for 50 years, like the United States, every year a current account deficit, that piles up, and the gross foreign debt position of the United States stands at about 210 or so % of GDP. I'm saying gross, but that needs to be refinanced every year. Okay, the United States has also assets abroad, no? And the net position is at about 100% of GDP, negative. And so that worries me, that we have these big debt positions that seem stable, but as it goes with financial crisis, everything looks good until things crash. And so that I think we should worry about and help the Americans rebalance. I think there is a case for cooperative action here, not in the way that Stephen Moran talks about the Mar-a-Lago Accord. No, it's not an accord as he puts it, but rather a Mar-a-Lago dictate. No? But I think we would be well advised, including the Chinese, to work towards reducing those imbalances. On sanctions, there's a big project that we run at WIFO together with colleagues from the University of Constance and again Philly, Drexel University of Philadelphia. It's a global sanctions database. So those who are interested in sanctions, go there. We have a website that can be consulted, and a lot of work that comes from this. I could talk about another 2 hours about our sanctions work, but I won't today. And then on this annoying business of forecasting, Fabio, yes. That is annoying. We'd rather celebrate how accurate our models are, right? So this would be nicer for us. And Marion was right, this is embarrassing in many ways. But it's also embarrassing because we often do not clarify in the public that what we provide with trade models is not a forecast. It is a comparative statistics exercise. So if you put those tariffs, this hurts the United States, this generates inflation, this reduces growth. But it's not a forecast because as you said, there is a lot of other things happening, of course. No? If you have a fiscal stimulus, that may counteract those actions. And in that sense, there's a little bit of things that we can do as a profession to separate more clearly between what is a forecast and what are comparative statistics results. Having said that, I think some of the forecasts were, even a year ago, were unlikely to materialize. On inflation, for example, about 10% of the US consumption basket is made up by imported goods, not more. Right? So if you have 15% imports plus 15% depreciation, that gives you a cost shock, a price shock of 30 if everything's passed through. So this would be, it's very unlikely, but let's assume it. And with a 10% weight in the basket, that would give you over time a surplus inflation of 3%. And distribute that over 5-6 years, we are far away from things that we saw in Europe over the gas price crisis and so on. So, and this is what I just sketched is, the most horrible scenario imaginable, and likely much less brutal. So, I think there's the idea that this is going to hit strongly enough to make a policy reversal. That idea, I think, is unrealistic. But it could, slowly eat into growth of the United States. If that happens soon enough before the midterms, no. Will it happen before the presidential election, the next? Maybe. But these processes take time. Anyways, I think it was great. Let me say thank you here, and also to the nice questions that have been asked.
Okay. Thank you, Gabriel. Let me conclude by thanking all the presenters, Marion online in the first place, Baptiste and Gabriel here on the podium. Also thanks to you, to the audience for your contributions, for your questions. Also the online audience, I apologize for not being able to take up the last question that has been asked here. Unfortunately, time is up. At the peak time, it was about 50 listeners online. And just very briefly, the next event in this series will be again a climate talk on a green transition and defense. Also an interesting topic. It will take place sometime in in January next year. So I hope to see you again, and now enjoy socializing at the buffet. Thanks again, and see you.